to the History of Ceramics. I'm Paul Greenhouse.
And I'm Stephanie Rosine. Last week, we left off a discussion about the life and work of Lucie Rie and the moment in which, in 1946, a young immigrant, Hans Koper, knocks on her door and asks for work. And so today, we're going to dive into the second half of this story of what brought Hans to her doorstep and how they would go on to have this beautiful partnership, collaboration, and friendship.
We don't get too many seminal moments in the history of ceramics, do we? But I would say 1946, when he banged on that door and she opened it and spoke to her in a German accent and she took him in, I think that moment changed the history of ceramics.
So I think, though, before we really get to that moment, we need to talk a little bit about, we need to wind ourselves back and talk a little bit about how he got there. What was his journey like? And we know he survived this incredible tragedy. We're going to talk about his kind of terrifying flight from Germany, his time in internment camps, and how his sort of restless sculptural vision of clay would push both he and Lucie into the creation of some of the greatest works of 20th century ceramics. So today, Paul, we're going to be picking up right where we left off on our two-part series on the life and work and collaborative partnership of Lucie Rie and Hans Koper. So, Paul, let's talk a little bit about his early life before he arrived in London. He comes from a poor background.
No, he didn't, actually.
Okay.
And good to dispel. We love artists to come from poor backgrounds, don't we? We love that poverty. He didn't.
Okay.
He came from a well-off professional family. He was born in 1920 in Chemnitz in Germany, and he was brought up in the nearby Reichenbach, which was a prosperous little town. So his early childhood was comfortable and tolerably wealthy. His dad, Julius, was a manager of a textile mill, which I think is going to be important. And the family enjoyed quite a level of luxury. I mean, they had a chauffeur-driven car, and, so that would set a benchmark. So we're talking about an affluent, well-off, middle-class family in the middle of Germany.
We know that he was a bright, curious kid. He showed an early aptitude for art, and his parents encouraged that. But life would completely change when he became a teenager.
Things change, absolutely, yes. And it's wise just to note a couple of dates here. He was born in 1920. That would make him 18 years younger than Lucie Rie. So that's something to remember for the future relationship. You know, he was significantly younger than Lucie when he met her. But 1920 also means that he was 13 when Adolf Hitler came to power. So right at the beginning of his adolescence, right at the beginning of that formation of his young life, life was going to be utterly transformed. So, to remind ourselves, he came from a wealthy family, chauffeur-driven car, and then in 1933, Hitler and the National Socialists start to address the Jewish population.
And his family were subjected to sort of immediate and intense harassment because of their Judaism.
Yeah. I mean, it's a story it's a heartbreaking story which has been told many times, but it is an interesting aspect that the successful middle classes, the wealthier, they seem to be hit hardest, quickest, I would say. The part of the Jewish population that had power economically and so forth. So his family were harassed right from the start. It was very early on. They tried to get out of the way. They moved first to Dresden, which was thought to be a slightly safer place, but it wasn't really. And it's almost as though they started to become nomadic. They started to look around to places and towns where they might be a bit safer.
And that's initially also because his father loses his job. So he no longer has this income from the textile trade. The family sort of plunges into financial ruin.
Financial and social ruin. His father has lost his job. they start to look around Germany to where they might be safer. And this sense of moving from a highly successful lifestyle to be stripped of just about everything impacted the family desperately. And we would say the first major tragedy in Cowper's life is that his father, Julius, just could not cope. And in 1936, he took his own life. So at this stage, Hans is 16. It's important to emphasize these points in his life, because to lose your father to suicide at 16, but also to be looking around the country and suddenly to be feeling alien in the community that you're in. So it was happening to millions of people, and the Cowpers felt the brunt of it.
And so Hans, by 1939, he would feel this intense pressure, feeling that immigration was his only option, and he actually leaves his family behind. He flees Germany alone, which is something I can't even fathom. And reading the notes for this episode, just reading the harrowing account of sort of what that escape took, and what happened to him on that journey it's hard to wrap your head around.
It's each of these instances is a life-changing experience, isn't it? We would say. So, 1939, his mother wasn't Jewish, and therefore relatively safe. And this, again, apparently occurred quite a lot in Germany at the time, that if one individual in the marriage was not Jewish, it led to the artificial splitting up of families everywhere, because you would be relatively safe. You wouldn't be safe if you were still with your Jewish partner. So his brother escaped by ship, and Cowper realized that he was going to have to try and escape. So at the age of 19, they made sure their mother was safe, and they moved away from her. And we should just say as a footnote, he never saw his mother again. He didn't see his brother again for decades. And this lad is going through a desperate trauma to get himself out of Germany. So he hid in Wiesbaden, first of all, which is a little German spa town east of Luxembourg, and sat there hidden away, waiting for a safe train to get him out of the country. And in actual fact, it's almost the stuff of a desperate war movie. He did take a train, and the Gestapo boarded the train, and he had to hang out of the carriage on the outside of the train until they'd gone, and he managed to climb back in and to get out of the country.
And this is when the train is moving.
It's when the train was moving. Yeah. So we just can ponder on what that means for your lifestyle.
Yeah.
You're losing everything at that stage.
But he does finally make it to London.
He gets to London.
Yeah.
Of course, he's a German man.
Yeah.
So life's not going to be easy or pleasant there. He found lodgings in Bloomsbury. He was depressed. He was poverty-stricken. He did muse in future years, and it's a first indicator of this man's wonderful character, that he actually said it as a joke, that he tried to commit suicide, but by gassing himself, and he had no money, and the gas ran out. So he survived because he was broke. And he would tell this as a joke, but it must have chilled the people around him when he said this. So after that, it seems to me that this true depth, it couldn't get lower, because war was declared. He was an enemy alien again.
Just like Lucie Rie.
Just like Lucy. But he didn't have the connections that Lucy had. She suffered. But Hans was interned. He was categorized as an enemy alien. And they had levels of how bad you were, A, B, and C. He was thought to be someone who was potentially a risk. Now, we can see the dark side of this, but at the same time, the British are at war. So there are German spies in the country. So clearly they were sorting out the German population, the expatriate German population, in a pretty crude way at that stage. And what they did to a very large number of them was to send them to Canada.
Mhm.
Now, getting to Canada in a ship must have been an extremely risky business at that point in time, and there are interesting documentation to show that the Germans perhaps aware that some of these ships were full of Germans, but they got to Canada.
And what are the conditions there? They're rosy and pleasant?
Incredibly nice in Canada, of course. So you can imagine a Canadian winter.
Yeah.
So they were in pretty basic railway sheds, surrounded by barbed wire in Quebec, French-speaking Canada. They were really treated as prisoners of war, in no way different, despite the fact that they had escaped Germany, and many of them, quite a lot of them, had been there for many years. But in the first instance, it was very crudely done. But actually, as time went on, a more humane aspect, as they realized that many of the people they had there were in actual fact not only harmless, but were potential allies, potential people who could fight the cause for Britain. So eventually, he was returned back to the UK, where he took up a role basically doing manual labour. It was called the Pioneer Corps. And the Pioneer Corps, British very good at names. So the Pioneer Corps was basically made up of expat Austrians, Germans, and so forth. And they were digging roads and digging.
So it's sort of
but nevertheless, he was back home, or he was back in the UK, and he was surrounded by people he could talk to, and he made friends.
Mhm. So he's doing this exhausting manual labor, volunteering for the Pioneer Corps, and I would imagine that kind of work is a bit mind-numbing.
Again, not a lot of love lost. The local population would be hardly treating them well. It's a dark situation that we're in, but we would say that the one saving grace was that Cooper could speak German to various others, and he did make a few friends who remained friends for the rest of his life. Very intense relationships. We should also note at this stage, because it's going to come back, his health was already not good. And clearly, the way he'd been treated, it was not going to get much better. But so a sickly man at that stage.
So he there's a story of that he was just so exhausted by this work. We know that he was malnourished. He was not getting enough food. He was doing this hard manual labor, and he decides to take the day off, and he goes to the cinema and he sees Gone with the Wind, not once, but twice. And the next day he's fired. Which is what leads him is to seek help from this refugee organization, and eventually leads him right to Lucie Rie's door.
Yeah.
So I think we could talk a little bit about what he walks into, right? And he walks into this space at Albion Mews that's sort of positively a hive of activity, and we're in this a bit of post-war moment where I love this British slogan: "Britain can make it." If anything can be made, it can be made here. They're trying to rebuild manufacturing, and the Mews House, we know, was established as a licensed button making factory. And inside we can kind of imagine a bustling kind of picture of other refugees, a girl from France, Japan, two girls from Vienna, all sort of frantically working to produce these buttons for the high fashion industry. And these buttons are press molded buttons. So presumably Lucie would make the master buttons, and then they would create a mold for it so the clay could be pressed into the mold, peeled out, and then they'd have to pierce in these little holes for the button. And Hans is put right to work on these buttons.
He certainly is. So it's, the bigger context, I suppose. Britain's economy had been destroyed. in effect. And yes, that lovely slogan, Britain can make it. It's debatable, isn't it, whether we made it. But we're in a period also, there's an extraordinary event politically, in that, in many ways, the great warlord, the hero of the Second World War for the British, Winston Churchill, would have assumed that he would win an election in 1946. In actual fact, he didn't. There was a landslide to the Labour Party, and most of the basic institutions which the British still love, the health service, the welfare state, and so forth, were created then. And there are endless schemes right across the board to try and help recovery. This is important because Lucie Rie and Hans Cooper actually benefit from that in various ways as Britain starts to rebuild itself. He wouldn't be aware. He was hungry. He'd almost been killed. He was in an alien country who'd locked him up. But nevertheless, when he entered into Lucie's environment, there's a positive new dimension to how life might be.
Yeah.
Now, as we were saying, the buttons were her life's blood, but already she had a second thing going on.
Right.
Which was she was making work again in a pretty serious way. On her own, there were, the gang, the little United Nations gang, were making the buttons, and Lucie had time to start making her magnificent pots again. So that's the environment that Hans enters, and it's the saving of him.
It is. I think so. This kind of intense, detailed, repetitive work. I think it starts to ignite the creative aspect of his mind, and perhaps the atmosphere in that space. We talked a little bit last week about the way in which Lucie Rie's studio was a bit of a salon of bringing different intellectuals in, and it creates this, I think, a safe space of refuge. And he's a natural at working with material, right? He has a facility with clay, even though he's never touched it or used it before. And we can think back to prior to his escape from Germany. As a young boy, he had an aptitude for art, had an interest for art, and he was able to learn incredibly fast about this material with Lucie. And he would ask her to teach him the potter's wheel.
Absolutely. Now, it's good just to start to package this together a little bit. One of the things which I find most interesting, because it's debatable whether Lucie was a great teacher. I think she terrified people, and then she did teach in her later years. So, but one thing she had an amazing eye for talent. And very early on, even though he was pressing buttons, she realized he got an aptitude. Now, as you say, he had been dabbling and thinking about art. He was thinking about, as Lucie had way back, that sculpture might be his way forward. But there were drawings, and he had started to use his hands where he could in those years. But just to put a structure on it again from a time point of view, he's 26. So half his life up to that moment had been about persecution, escape, the death of his family, and so on and so forth, and being alone in the UK from the age of 13, when Hitler came to power, through to the moment he banged on that door. He'd had nothing but grimness and terror, and suddenly he was in a place where people cared about him. So very, very important.
And I want to dig into something you just said there too about Lucie not necessarily being a great teacher, and when Hans asks to learn the potter's wheel, she sends him out.
She did.
She sends him out to the local Woolwich Polytechnic school to learn under an instructor named Herbert Matthews. And it takes him just a mere few days to master the potter's wheel. And again, if we can think back to last week's episode, Lucie Rie had a similar quick learning curve on the potter's wheel. So he comes back, and Lucie's kind of amazed. He's taken like fish to water. He's mastered the potter's wheel in just a few days, and but she doesn't sort of just let him off the hook, does she? He's still making buttons in the morning and then throwing pots in the afternoon.
Yeah, she doesn't really. We love Lucie Rie, don't we? And she was still watching him, and she could see that he had talent. She was pretty shocked at how quick he picked it up, and it's clear that the boy had a feel for it and could throw in a very, very short period of time.
And anyone out there listening who has ever sat down at the potter's wheel, having no experience at the potter's wheel, the majority of folks are going to have a significant amount of frustration. It's going to take months, years, a lot of time and repetitive skill building to get to that place. But he's not that. He just gets it.
You're looking at somebody.
I know I am.
who did not get it, and so that aptitude is quite rare.
Right. So it's not the norm, is
No.
what we're saying here. But I do think, in some senses, Lucie Rie is his teacher.
There's no doubt about that. So what happens is he's back in the studio. He's still making buttons, but she starts to let him do things. Is he making his own work? Well, no, maybe he gets a few on the sly, but she's letting him take part in the vessel making more significantly. So, to sum up, so this young man has been through hell. He finally lands in a safe haven, and he discovers clay, and Lucie Rie has realized that she's got a talent on her hands quite unique, because everyone else in the studio, nobody else is allowed to touch the pots. Nobody else is given that training or is sent out or whatever. So she realizes that Hans has got something.
Yeah.
And there's a beginning of the famous relationship.
Sure. And I think there are also accounts that this idea of her being labeled as his teacher kind of irritated her. That she really saw them as true equals and collaborators. And in fact, by 1949, just 2 years after meeting, they're making work together. And you can find, when you look at that work, two kind of distinct maker's marks stamped onto the bottom of those pots. We can look at them and we can understand that they have some similar life experiences in many ways. Both come from fairly wealthy Jewish families. Both had to flee the Nazis. But their personalities and lifestyles are not the same, right? They're kind of incredibly different.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? The relationship. So. And lots of people have speculated on it over the years, and very fine scholars have looked in on it. First of all, it's reasonably clear that what is going on here, in my view anyway, is big sister, younger brother, in that sense. Secondly, yes, whilst they've had a similar trajectory that put them both in London, he's had an appallingly grim time, and was struggling to kind of pull it back together. And I think it's more than fair to say that Lucie was vital in putting him on a tram line.
She's sort of the stabilizing force, and he is, on the other hand, completely and deeply restless.
Right. So she has, as we said, she moves into Albion Mews, never leaves it.
Yeah.
She decides ceramics the thing for her, never leaves it. Would we ever consider Lucie Rie a sculptor? No, she's a potter making art, i.e. pots are art. Cowper's really quite different, as we know. He fell in love with clay and mastered it, and got there partly by accident. He'd thought about sculpture, he'd thought about various other things, and had made some pieces as well, including a rather beautiful bust of Lucie. But always anxious and always curious about his art, and always trying to push it somewhere else, and always trying to make ceramic do something else. So she enjoyed that relationship. And as you were hinting, as she lets him get involved on the wheel and in the wares, she didn't consider him a pupil. She was very magnanimous, I think. He's 18 years younger than her. and he hadn't got a clue when he came to the studio, but she treats him as an equal, so much so that we have a very significant range of wares by 1948 onwards, as you're saying, Stephanie, which have got both their marks on.
So, although they worked together, they had very different temperaments. In some ways, we might call them polar opposites. She loved classical music, he loved jazz. She stayed, as you said, in Albion Mews until her death in 1995. He would move from London to the countryside and back multiple times. She was somewhat kind of closed and quiet. Hans, while fiercely sort of private, was also a bit of a ladies' man, party goer. He loved to be in the company of people. But this contrast, I think it just goes to illustrate you don't have to be the same person to collaborate with each other. You don't have to have any friendships and partnerships. In many ways, I think that when we have these differences, they kind of bring each other together in different aspects out. And I think that that's really on display here with Lucie and Hans in this kind of incredible chemistry in the studio that they had.
I think you summed it up perfectly. He never lost the nomadic life. He never lost it, both in terms of moving around and in his head. And by all accounts, well, both of them lovely people. By all accounts, an incredibly lovely person. As you've suggested, perhaps a ladies' man, but I think, we're not talking promiscuous and so forth. I think it's all part and parcel of his restlessness of settling and trying to settle and trying to find.
And do you think that that's a result of he had a settled, prosperous life as a young boy, and that was all torn to shreds, and so he's constantly sort of seeking or not willing to allow himself that he's now safe or in a supported place? Do you think that there's some that restlessness comes from those life experiences?
There's absolutely no doubt that that's what it's about, that he has everything torn away from him, not slowly, but quite suddenly. And then he's alone for years.
But despite all of that, there are accounts of him being not withdrawn socially. There are accounts of him being a really wonderful teacher, where perhaps Lucie was not, and Lucie was a bit strict and stern, maybe coming out of that Vienna Werkstatt-esque teaching or learning model. So they view clay in a different way. They view teaching in a different way. Lucie thinks of herself as a potter. Does Hans?
It's an interesting question. And actually, what we would say in the broader scheme of things is that clearly these objects are not directly functional.
Right.
They're clearly objects for contemplation. Nevertheless, they're made on a wheel. And using all the technologies that ceramic has. So I would say what we're dealing with is that, the ceramic discipline is a broad church, and it became his absolute means of self-expression, the wheel.
Yeah, I'm thinking about actually some work that we saw just the other day at the V&A, where there's a case and there's sort of two, I don't know, maybe we could call them loosely both vase sort of forms, and it was a Rie and a Koper. And Lucie's pot, had a bottle type shape. Clearly, you could see a sprig of some sort of flower being in that object, whereas Hans' Koper piece, while also not a massive piece, very thin walls. But there's a sculptural aspect to it. There's almost a monument kind of aspect to the work, where it feels quite grounded. I think they both also had that incredible ability to merge the surface of their vessels with the clay, so that it doesn't feel as though the surface has been done to it. It's part of it. It's emerging from the materiality.
Yeah.
I can see some direct correlation. And I would imagine that Hans Koper is looking at things like Brancusi, Henry Moore. There's a monumentality to this work, even though it's not monumental.
Yeah, The mature work,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so absolutely appropriate to call it sculpture,
Yeah.
but very much in the world of ceramic in terms of
Well,
how it's conceived.
it's vessel, right? It's not pottery, it's a vessel. And so I
Mm.
think that for me, at least as a maker, that kind of occupies two different spaces, one tied to utility and one that is about the vessel as representation.
And through the entire history of ceramics, as we continually see, not all of the objects are meant for kind of functional use. Despite the fact they come out of that universe, they're objects of contemplation. And that's what Hans has given to us. In actual fact, uh, it's very much the feeling of Lucie's work as well, except Lucie's work clearly is usable and functional. Hans moved on a step from that.
Right. So I think we should take a minute to sort of maybe describe the aesthetic of their work and think about the work. I think, Lucy, we could classify with these sort of delicate, flared bowls on these tiny foot rings. Hans is creating these really textured, kind of more monumental forms. And he would throw all of the pieces on the wheel and then he would sort of assemble them together. And so you
Yep.
might have a piece that was thrown on the wheel, but then turned on its side and changed. And, a lot of pieces with sort of an altered, almost oval-like base that almost is like a plinth or a pedestal, and then these rounder, larger, wide forms that have also clearly been thrown on the wheel, but then turned. So you sort of see the spiral aspect of the mark of making. Like there's no way that you can't look at these Hans Koper's work and not understand that it was thrown on the wheel, and he preserves that.
I think also there's something else going on here, and that is he became fascinated by prehistoric and ancient art. He was very, very interested in the art of the Cyclades, ancient Greek, that is way pre-classical. Extraordinary figures which have been simplified out and abstracted. So a typical Cycladic figure looks a little bit like a kind of musical instrument. It's a human form, but it's been flattened
Sort of
and
stretched
shaped.
and
Yeah.
elongated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Hans loved these forms and saw them in the museums, but certainly the British Museum had them. So there's something else there: timelessness, permanence. There's something about Brancusi's work, when you look at it, you kind of think it's about forever. It's about eternal, universal values. And this is also something around in British art generally. We've got a country which had been more or less leveled and its economy destroyed. And it's very interesting for me that quite a lot of the avant-garde art that comes out of Britain post-war is trying to deal with stability, permanence, and British abstract art often picks up on that. When you look at Koper, you feel they're timeless, these pieces.
And I think he wrote something quite beautiful about the pot, I think sort of as an idea. And he said a pot is a humble, passive, somehow absurd object, yet potent, mysterious, sensuous. It conveys no comment, but it seems to contain and reflect its maker. And for me, that's a wonderful artist statement. But when you look at those objects, they feel as like a marker.
Yeah.
They have a sense of breadth and that they're full of air and that they're living, breathing sort of objects that you question and you're not quite sure about, but that they're containing something. And so I love that. He would eventually take his knowledge, though, to the classroom.
He would. So before Lucy, actually, he started to teach quite seriously. He taught at Camberwell for a while, and then most famously became a teacher at the Royal College of Art. The professor at the Royal College of Art at the time was the wonderful David Queensberry, and who himself was a ceramic artist and ceramic designer, and hired a range of absolutely seminal people to teach the students at the Royal College. So at one time, Edoardo Palozzi, perhaps arguably Britain's single greatest sculptor alongside Henry Moore and one or two others, was teaching ceramics. And he was involved in ceramics, but really a more mainstream sculptural artist. And at that time, Cooper was also there teaching. So, gosh, what people to be taught by and brought on.
He and Lucy both taught at Camberwell, though.
Right.
And I think one of the anecdotes that I just found that I think demonstrates just their difference in their personality and their temperament is that Rie was famously blunt, that she stripped her critiques of all social niceties, often telling students that their work was hopeless, suggesting that they, quote, try teapots for discipline. And anyone who's tried to make a teapot knows how difficult those are. So I think it's a quite sort of cheeky response to basically tell students that they're never going to be any good.
I think it's wonderful, isn't it?
Cooper would actually describe her teaching style as a steel fist in a suede glove, which this is not at all the approach that Hans had.
I would think you wouldn't get away with it these days. You would upset people too much. But I find it interesting also that Hans was the one encouraging Lucy to get, I think he taught first, even though he's the younger, and took her in. And I think she enjoyed it and loved it. But yeah, told people what the reality was of the situation. Wonderful. I know also quite a lot of now the older generation of British potters who either knew her or were taught by her would verify that you got to know what she thought in a pretty straightforward way.
But Cooper was not at all this way.
No, he wasn't.
He excelled at teaching. There are accounts from past students and writing that he would work to get inside the mind of the student, but then ruthlessly ask them why they were making something before he would ever ask how they were making something.
Yeah.
And this, even today, is one of my biggest beefs when I sit in a critique with students from different disciplines. Every single time, the first question out of someone's mouth is, well, how did you make that? But we're not having that conversation when we talk about painting. And I love that this is really Hans's ethos. He's wanting to know about, well, what is the thing about? One of my great teachers, Walter Ostrom, would always ask, what is it about? What is the thing trying to do? And Hans Cooper does that as well. It's not to say that you don't have a necessity of understanding how the material works, because we all need to know how our materials work in order to use them. But this emphasis on why over how, I think, is one of these beautiful, beautiful pieces about the way that he taught.
I couldn't agree more.
And it's reflected from, I think, his own studio practice.
Yeah, I think that he was keen that his students understood what they were trying to do beyond the technical and beyond the almost as though, you've learned how to write now and you can spell and you can do all, what are you going to write about?
Right.
And I think is a big one. One of our greatest living ceramic artists, Elizabeth Fritsch, was one of that generation at the Royal College whom he taught. And she said, Hans' teaching had the same integrity and strength as had his pots, graceful, direct, precisely and sensitively tuned. So the idea that you help the students discover themselves. There is something else going on in the mix here as well, which I find very interesting, and that is Cooper became interested in architecture. And again, this, the restless creative mind, and did a range of architectural projects, which are basically, it would be a stretch in the classic sense to say they're tile, but certainly the function of tile, architectural ornament. One of his most prestigious commissions, in actual fact, he did the giant candlesticks for Coventry Cathedral. To call them candlesticks, they're meters high. Coventry Cathedral, it was one of the great medieval cathedrals which was bombed flat in the Second World War. So the rebuilding of it in a modernist idiom, very symbolic in Britain. And Cowper was one of the artists chosen, alongside other artists like Graham Sutherland, our leading painters and artists of the time. So that's a tribute to where Cowper had come to stand within British culture at that stage. And I suppose we would say at that stage that, yes, British very keen to say he's British.
Right, right.
Yeah, and Lucie Rie, she's British.
Yeah,
They're both British.
And
yes.
that brings, I think, me back to a comment I made in our last episode, is that I've always thought about them as being British, but they're not.
Maybe a small political point we might make there, that actually Britain has always been a migrant culture. And going forward, like large parts of America, our cultures have grown rich on hosting and looking after artistic migrant populations and other migrants across the range of disciplines. But very important to remember that cultural activity of all kinds, and especially in the modern period, has been totally dependent on migration.
Well, and you and I both certainly value an international relationship between our own friendship,
I think so,
but
yes.
in the ways in which art can cross over borders and bleed through political contexts. And here we have these two incredible people who did just that, right? Hans, a young man whose life was violently uprooted by the Nazis, lost his father to suicide, survived internment camps, factory lines, and yet he walked into that dusty basement, or well, not basement, but garage, into this bustling button factory at Albion Mews, and he found clay. And alongside, he found this lifelong friendship and collaborator in Lucie Rie. And he took this really, one could say humble material, and he elevated it, bringing his sculptural vision of Brancusi and the rhythm of jazz right into that pottery studio.
Absolutely, he did that. And we would say in the bigger picture, and it's why we value them both so highly, they changed the direction of British ceramics. And alongside that, their work became known internationally and globally. They're in all the great museums, and they shifted the direction of studio ceramics more than anybody else, which then led the way, because they were also teachers, for the dramatic opening up of ceramic art into the wonderful creature we now have.
Yeah, that it could be sculptural, that it could hold emotion, that it could be something other than just a utilitarian object, which, as a maker of utilitarian objects, I'm not discounting those things, but it broadened the conversation and the landscape around what a vessel could do.
And to come right back to your very first point, way back, the reason we dealt with the two of them together, because they're both greats, was simply because their relationship is absolutely key, isn't it?
It is.
It's a wonderful relationship on every level, of the one saving the other and looking after the other, and then growing as two artists. They're two interdependent greats.
Yeah. And that sounds like a great way to end. So again, thanks for listening and being here with us today. And if you like what you heard, give us a follow and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
So if you want to see more of their incredible work, check out the exhibition Lucie Rie, Hans Cowper, Life at the Wheel, which will be on view at the Offer Waterman Gallery in London, middle of September to the end of October.